So we're getting to the last two panels of the day, and thank you for staying with us. A couple of sort of housekeeping remarks. One is we have a wonderful reception for you after the event, so please stick around. And two, please complete your evaluations whether you leave now or later, because we do read all your evaluations very carefully and do our best to incorporate your feedback. So that would be welcome. What's that? They're very digital. And because we couldn't, we've learned, no, this is very thought through, Ken, because let me tell you something. When you do online evaluations in universities, the sort of response rate goes from 90% to 20%. So we give you paper. We know we believe in paper where it works. But with, I'm glad you guys have been listening. If you haven't figured that much out by now, we would be in deep trouble with this conference. But with that, I don't even know what that has to do with anything. But I am going to turn the floor over to Xavier, who is going to kick off this sort of really exciting panel that we've got with sort of a younger company perspective on digital transformation. So take it away, Xavier.
Thank you, Vijay. So as we get going here, just a quick, almost lightning round of intros. Alex, you want to lead us out and just give us a quick snapshot, because our brands may not be as well known as, say, some of the big company boards from whom we heard earlier today.
Yes, absolutely. So career entrepreneur, I've been part of starting 4 companies. My last company that I was CEO of got acquired by Salesforce, where I was GM and EVP of the second largest business unit. It was a roughly $1 billion business unit when I left. And about 2 years ago, I joined a company called Campaign Monitor, which is email marketing. We've got 150,000 customers all over the world. They did a $250 million financing and brought me in as CEO.
Tom?
So my name's Tom Frangione. They call me the COO at Greylock. Greylock is a venture capital firm, invests mostly in software businesses, both enterprise software and consumer software. Names you might have heard of, things like Workday, Palo Alto Networks, Facebook, LinkedIn, Airbnb, Docker. I'll keep doing advertisements later. I've been at Greylock about 5 years. Previous to that, similar to Alex, with slightly smaller outcomes. Started 2 companies, one of which Nielsen acquired. So hopefully have a little bit of a sense of what's going on with small companies.
And my background, I worked, I think, 4 or 5, depending upon how you want to count, startups along the way, either IPO or acquisition on all of those. Not smart enough to be the founder, but I'm the guy they bring in to kind of nail it and scale it, and really drive change even inside a small company. So my perspective is a different one. It's all the things that got you here aren't going to get you there. And that's a very interesting pivot in the life of a small company, and I want to share that perspective today as best I can. But as we get going, why don't we talk a little bit about how you know when it's time to start driving change? And Tom, drawing both on your experience at Telefia and your experience now in the chair at Greylock, how do you advise companies? How do you know, hey, what do you look at? How do you know it's time to start driving something new?
Yeah, I think, obviously, we deal with much, like you talked about, Xavier, smaller, younger companies. So many times the change is kind of constant in early days, right? Pivot is the word that people like to use a lot. But I do think you'll see, very consistent themes between what smaller companies and larger companies should be thinking about. So part of it's going to be the obvious things about customer engagement and are you actually achieving your strategic goals? But I love thinking about venture-funded companies that have had those seminal moments as well. So I love thinking about Netflix, right? Netflix, was a tremendously successful company, understood where their business was going well in advance of what others did. And, they may not have handled it perfectly when they were going to spin out one business and these kinds of things, but Reed Hastings had the guts to actually step up and take a play on that. So I just think most of it is, understanding a little bit about, what your core business is, understanding what the key elements of your customers and their desires are, and trying to, better understand the sort of technical implications that are coming down the path. And sometimes you're going to have to make big bets, right? And that's very hard, obviously. But those are the kinds of things that we think about a lot for our young companies. And I'm sure, once again, not having sat in the seat of a CEO of a large company, but you got to be thinking in similar ways, I think.
Alex?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I mean, I think you have to identify freight trains in your life, and see if you're in front of one or on one, right? And you obviously want to be on one. The hard thing is to determine, which is which, right? So for me, it's looking at the data. So quantitatively understanding what's happening in the business, what are the kind of the core KPIs of the business, what are the unit economics. It's qualitatively talking to customers. You can't get a substitute for that to marry those two together and really understand, are you solving a problem or are you a nice to have? It's understanding the macro condition, right? So you're seeing now the fundraising climate changing dramatically. So I think DNAs of businesses have to change to kind of adjust for the macro economic climate, and then seeing what's happening more so in your market and with competitors. And I think if you synthesize all those things, you can take a good hard look at, are you on a freight train or in front of one?
That's a great point.
Yeah, the question I often pose is, what can go wrong and how bad can it get? And when you can frame the answers to that question, the path forward ultimately becomes clear. And it may not necessarily be we know exactly what to do, but we certainly know a series of actions to take that it will enable us to continue to move forward in the direction we want to go. And as one of my old colleagues, who is, I think, still in the room, likes to say, you never want to mistake a clear view for a short distance. So keeping your vision focused on where it is that you want to go with an understanding of what can go wrong and how bad can it get will really, I think, enable you to know, hey, it's time to move here. Like this can get really bad really fast if we don't make some moves. The margin reaper always comes calling, and you need to be ready for the day to get that knock on the door. So with that as a little bit of perspective, Alex, I'll throw it back to you. Stepping in as the first outside CEO, obviously a time of tremendous change in the company. How did you get the organization on board, and how do you keep them there?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's I'm kind of living through this over the last 2 years or so at Campaign Monitor. So I'll take you through what I did, and it seems to be working, although I don't think there's a kind of a finish line necessarily to it. I first started by interviewing every single person in the company. I don't think you want to change for the sake of change. You have to have the right understanding and foundation and data to make the change, and you have to take people through it. So by interviewing every single employee, the reason that I did that is I wanted to stand up in front of them and play back to them the fact that I was listening. Because if people believe you come in and change something without having heard them first, you're going to have an allergic reaction. You're going to have a lot of resistance. And so that was really great advice that I got from one of my mentors and advisors. So I played that back to them so they understood that I was listening to them. The second thing that we did is kind of a forensics on the business. We looked at it quantitatively at all the data. I went out and talked to customers qualitatively to understand what was happening, kind of looked at the market and the mega trends in the market, and we determined that we needed to, in fact, make a change. And so what we did then is we stood up in front of the company, and we very deliberately snapped the chalk line at the past, and we said, this was chapter 1. And we named it chapter 1 because what we didn't want people to continue to do is say, but we used to do it this way. It's okay that you used to do it that way. That's not a reflection of the future. So we paid homage to chapter 1 and all the successes that got us there. We shared with the company the challenges that the business was experiencing. And then we clearly outlined a vision for chapter 2. So we got everybody aligned on kind of directionally what we wanted to do, which was incredibly important. And we did that in an all hands, and then we continue to reinforce that. This is where I'll completely disagree with Richie, coming out of Salesforce. Then what you need to do once you have everybody kind of directionally aligned on a vision is you need a framework to get everybody to understand what is it that they're doing that contributes to the success of the company, and how does that align to strategy? And that's a framework that at Salesforce, Mark Benioff and Parker Harris developed called the V2 MOM. It stands for Vision, Values, Methods, Obstacles, and Measures. It's a very deliberate framework. It's a living document. It lasts for 12 months, and then you revisit it. Now, you take that V2 MOM, and you cascade it down to the entire company. And so every group then has their own V2 MOM, and every employee in the company knows what part of that method they're supporting, what are the obstacles they face, what are the measures for success. And that gives them a really great framework to make decisions, because you don't want to have a command and control structure. You want to push decision-making down to the individuals who are at the front of it. So we put in a V2 MOM, shared that with the company. They created kind of their own supporting methods in support of the company V2 MOM, and we've been kind of executing against that since.
Yeah. Tom, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's two things that I think is really interesting, and I think larger companies can benefit from this. Yes, it's harder to interview everyone in the company, but I do think that notion of understanding at a detailed level what's happening at multiple levels in the company is massively important. The other thing that I think is totally interesting when you think about building a culture or reestablishing a culture or understanding where that goes, there's great stories about early on at Google, and I know from personal experience at Workday, like Aneel Bushry and Dave Duffield interviewed every single person in the first 500 they hired, right? So, once again, that sounds crazy, right? You have your CEO and chairman interviewing every single person up to 500 people. But that's how important culture was. And when you're going through a change like this, if in fact you're trying to hire new blood in or bring about that change, I think those kinds of interactions, part of it's symbolic in that it is just showing how important this particular item is. Just like you said, you met with everyone. We called it chapter 1. I mean, some of these are symbolic, but some of it is also just reinforcing that notion. And I think those things, there's probably kernels of that you can apply to much larger organizations. Like I said, I'm not an expert there, but it does strike me that there's some pretty interesting things there. So
I want to add something about culture. You said it too, which is really interesting. The experience that we went through also, once we kind of burned the boats and we delineated what happened in the past versus what was going to happen in the future, what I found is people would say, when we did something new, oh, you're changing the culture of the company. I heard that a lot. And so one of the things that we did there, because I actually fundamentally believe culture, in fact, does change. Culture at 10 people versus 100 people versus 1,000 or 10,000 is very different. By definition, if you're hiring for diversity, you're going to change culture with every new employee that you kind of bring into the company. And so what we did is we actually jointly had employees who volunteered come up with what they believe to be the values of the company were. Because I think the values are the foundation for culture, and values don't change. And then the management team and founders kind of put their own view on what they believe the values to be, and then we synthesized them. And the good news is, the Venn diagram was a huge overlap, right? And then again, we put that back out to the company, and we have 5 very clear values that don't change, but it also takes away this idea that culture is changing every time we try something new or hire a new person.
Yeah, I'll build on that a little bit. One of the phrases we use is there is joy in repetition. And when you're driving a change program, you cannot emphasize enough where it is that you're going. You can say it again and again and again and again and again, and you haven't said it enough. Right? If you don't hit 7 times in a real communication that happens through time, you have not done it enough. You may think that it is a tired old saw, and it is not. It has not sunk into the level where everyone in the organization can move on that. And that doesn't matter if you're a big company or a small company. There has to be joy in repetition. And I wholeheartedly agree. If that joy in repetition is anchored in values, you will get where you want to go. If it is anchored in moments of success, we will hit this sales milestone, we will win this many customers, we will reduce our cost to serve by X, those moments are fleeting. And you will hit them, and then what? You haven't actually changed. All you've done is move to a specific milestone on a journey that is largely unmapped. But if you have set a clear destination with a clear vision, with milestone markers along the way, with moments of success, and you sign the team up behind you, then you're really managing through a change process. At least that's my 2 cents for the day.
Your story.
That's my story. I'm sticking with it. And the other thing I would argue is you got to keep score. And so those moments of success matter. How do you keep score, Tom?
Look, it's a great question. Look, I think one of the ways we were talking about is, when you're changing a lot, does year-on-year kind of change matter and those kinds of metrics? Look, I'm a huge believer that people need to see progress, and progress can be growth. Progress can be different metrics. Look, I'm in a time of change, you may not want to emphasize this year versus last year, but at the same point, look, you got to set, like you did, a new baseline and say, look, here's where we are, and here's the kinds of things we're going to monitor. It doesn't always have to be sales or other kinds of metrics. Look, I was a huge believer that, we focused a lot on things like, not only did a customer, come back, but did they sign up for more? And it didn't matter what percentage more, but it was like they wanted more of what we had, right? I was a huge believer also in just things like, how many customers of ours wanted to come work at our company, right? There were just a bunch of silly things like that that, really weren't drivers of exactly what we wanted to do. But, everyone, was just kind of nice to point out to people like, look, we've had this customer actually came and joined us. These 4 people submitted resumes to us. It's those kinds of things to just let people know you're building towards something, even if it isn't that perfect metric. Clearly, you need metrics to drive the business. A mutual friend of ours, a guy named Tom Stahl, we were lucky enough to hire into my first company. And Tom was awesome at just very simple, like, hey guys, stop with all the crap you're measuring now. Let's sit down and understand the 4 things we should measure them. Let's measure the hell out of them and watch. Everyone's going to change their behavior against those. So you got to do that too, but I'm just also a big believer you got to find some that are a little bit off that track that kind of speak more to culture or broader things you're trying to drive to. So.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think momentum.
Man, we agree too much. We got to disagree a little.
I completely disagree.
All right, good, much better.
Tom is, I don't know.
He's
what
a moron.
What he's talking about. I disagreed with Richie. That helped.
That worked. Well done.
Where is Richie?
So I think that momentum is infectious, both positive and negative. And I think in a change situation, what you really want to see is just positive building momentum. And so again, in kind of that framework, that V2MOM framework, measures are important to kind of give you a directional view of where you're trying to go. I'd say limit the measures to the most impactful ones, no more than 3 kind of per method. But really the most important thing is the momentum.
Yeah, it's a good call.
Yeah, and I think the other piece to add to it is make sure, and I think we heard this earlier, that you're paying people for what you want them to do. So their own scorekeeping is their own checkbook. And if you want the change to be X, and their incentives, which get driven out of a V2MOM or an OGSM or whatever the different framework is that you use, the commitments and the cascades, or however you do it, but if their variable comp is clearly aligned to where you want to go, everybody's keeping score. And when everybody's keeping score in a way that adds up to the result that you want, it's going to work. But if you haven't cascaded variable comp measures down all the way through to the line, you're not going to get what you want. There's an old, this is where the academic in me comes out, there's an old treatise on the folly of asking for A and rewarding B. Right? And it was written, I think, 40 years ago, and it's still true. People don't do what you don't pay them to do, by and large. You may get a few oddballs out there, but by and large, people do what you pay them to do. So pay them to do things in a way that drive the change that you want to see.
Yeah.
And I was going to say the one thing that I would add to that is like there's payment in dollars and there's payment in other types of value that people want to come to work every day. Sometimes if you're a technical, on a technical track, it's getting to work on the coolest project. Sometimes, if it's you're a younger person, it's the ability to take on a project on your own, right? So to me, that payment, I think, can be monetary, but it also can be sort of that next thing that you were able to do that especially for me, once again, in small companies, like when you're starting a company in Silicon Valley, right? Day one, you by definition are paying the worst in anybody else, right? You are paying less than Facebook and Google and everybody else from a dollar perspective, and the only thing you are paying them is you're part of the dream, you're part of this culture, you're trying to build something, you're getting in on the ground floor, and maybe it's the much cooler project. Like, it sounds like silly now, but my first company, this big data at the time, we were processing, a terabyte of data a month, and this was 1998, and people were like, anybody, I had people coming at me from, every single player that handled, big, relational databases, because that was a lot of data, and it was a real challenge at that point, right? But like, you could get great people in that environment, and that's what we sold, right? So.
Yeah, I think financial compensation is the lowest on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's personal growth and it's autonomy to make decisions, which is kind of why we push down the framework to give people the way that they should be thinking about making those decisions.
Great call.
The other thing that we do that works really well and it reinforces our values is we do a monthly all hands, and in one of our hackathons, projects where people can do kind of anything they want, somebody built this really great program called Shout Out, where anybody in the company can go into it and pick one of the 5 values that we have in our company and pick an employee that they saw that was really representing that value and put a little note about that in there. And then we get hundreds of these things in, and we look at them and we filter down to the top 5. And in every monthly all hands, we will talk about those 5 employees that they were recommended, and here's why. That is obviously not a kind of financial payment, but that goes so far in both reinforcing the values and making people feel appreciated.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and I think it plays well too, and this is an area we talked about prior to this afternoon, is there are challenges that are different depending upon the scope, the scale, and the geographic dispersion of the team. And so Alex, you in particular, you got a big shop in Australia, you've got a second hub in the Bay Area, and I think a few other outposts. How do you keep, as you drive change, as you write the second chapter, how do you keep everybody in that same chapter moving together at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's probably been one of our greatest challenges. So we have a huge office in Sydney, one in San Francisco now. We're actually opening up one in London. So, pretty much as far as you can be from kind of one another. And communication is tough. So again, I hate to kind of beat a dead horse, but that V2 Mom framework and pushing autonomy and getting everybody aligned makes it much better. So you don't have to wait for somebody to wake up to be able to make a decision. And then the other thing that we found is we invested heavily in a video conferencing system. I know this sounds kind of crazy, but when you're trying to do an hour-long meeting with somebody and you spend the first 10, 15 minutes, like go to meet, what is that code? I can't, and it just sets up an incredibly frustrating remaining 40 minutes. And so we spent quite a bit of money on this great AV system. You push a button and you're directly visually connected kind of with another human being, and that's really helped in the communications. Yeah.
Tom, any moves from across your portfolio?
We tend to focus so much on small. I mean, look, I would just say, one of the interesting notions I saw was one of our partners was the CEO of Mozilla. So you get this open source kind of view where he had both employees and open source contributors all over the globe, and it was fascinating because they did not only kind of all hands, but they would do sessions with the whole community, right? And so, this notion of how do you find ways of touching the community, they started also finding ways where, they would have regional meetups, right? And executives would get out there and just go, and it would just be for anybody who's contributing to Mozilla, but these different ways of kind of getting out and touching the community. So look, I'm a huge believer that so much of, to your point, of a video conferencing thing, it's so much better to see someone smile and laugh, and you can start, getting a sense of who that person is. I mean, all of that stuff, it sounds silly, but in my opinion, it's just, that's the reason why people want to work together and why it should be a company as opposed to a bunch of different diverse groups that are, happen to be working together. I don't know, I just think that's the real stuff. So.
Yeah, I think, by the way, to your point on community, I think the way that companies inspire their employees is not to think about shareholders, it's to think about stakeholders. Yeah. And you kind of hear Mark Benioff talk about this quite a bit. And what that means is stakeholders are employees, stakeholders are customers, stakeholders are shareholders, but stakeholders are also the kind of the community at large. So one of the things that we do to get kind of people really excited about what they do is lots of giving back, a lot of volunteerism,
that's cool. A
lot of in community, right, in all the various communities where we are. And I think that really connects people to a much broader vision than just, you're an engine to make money. You're an engine to kind of create good.
That's cool.
The other thing I've seen work well is to get people lined up on concepts of levels of mastery of skill and have that universally understood across all of the different locations. So what are the categories of competency that matter in different parts of the organization? And it moves you away from an overwrought kind of HR-driven job description mindset and says, look, we need to be good if you're a services business. We need to be good at client management. We need to understand the competencies that exist within that. We need to be good at technology in a certain way, and certain skills really matter to us. And there are levels of mastery. And many of these competencies then enable you to move across the company. And really, the experience is part of the reward. And if you have a certain level of mastery in a competency category, you have set yourself up for moves to different parts of the organization in ways that you don't see if you are in a large company. So that becomes a payoff for the small company that's starting and growing and scaling. It's like, how do I make this happen? Well, you're enriching the experience of the employee. And I think that can be true if you're a carve out into a smaller shop, is kind of breaking some of those rules and standards and focusing more on what are those leverageable competencies and skills, and making sure you're helping your team build those and develop those, and see how that development then can move them forward in ways that perhaps were really unimaginable were it not working as part of your initiative. So, we hear, and I want to make sure we have time to do Q&A with folks. So one or two more questions, and then we'll open it up. We hear, hey, we need to act like a startup. Right? We got to act like a startup. What does that mean?
I'll throw a couple out, but look, the things to me that are magical, at least in the experiences I've been in that have been, positive, sort of growth situations are a couple things. One is, it's easy to say now, you allow people to fail, but like this notion that, I'm asking you to take on a project that has risk, right? And that ability to know as an employee or someone on the management team that, I'm going with you to take this risk. As long as we do things the right way, take the right risks and go after something, if project A fails or we don't quite reach our goals, that you're not punished. Look, that I think is massively important to me. Second is, and I think you hit on this a lot, is, autonomy. The ability to, when and we weren't unfortunately as structured as you talk about, but the ability to kind of say, look, this is the decision. Who are the 4 people? Get them in the room, and we're not leaving the room till we make a decision because we're not going to have better data. Like those kinds of things are, to me, massively important. And I guess the last one is kind of to build on the last thing you said. When you think about skills an organization has to have, understanding, who is the company that is doing that particular thing much better than anyone else, and take simple ones that everybody knows about. Like if you have to think about a scalable data center, who do you think about? It's Google, Facebook, Amazon, right? If you think about, like you talked about customer service, right? Who are the companies that have radically changed customer service and that you can learn from? Now, by the way, not every company needs to think about scale like data, like Google and those guys. So I don't know. To me, those are the kind of things that I think of as thinking of as a startup, but I don't know. What else?
Yeah, there's a government agency called DARPA, where some of the most really interesting things in the world come out.
Heard of
Have
them,
you
yeah.
They have an internal motto. It's a little I with a cube, I3, and it's the evolution of every project that happens, which is impossible, improbable, inevitable, right? And you have to have that mindset. And so I think if you're going to do a startup or act like a startup, you kind of have to have that type of mindset. And I'll kind of talk about it. I haven't been talking about big company, but one of the interesting things that we did to apply this at Salesforce is we had the benefit of working with Jeffrey Moore, who wrote Crossing the Chasm, a lot of other really interesting books. And he came up with a framework, a quadrant, for how at Salesforce we thought about departments acting like startups. And so if you were in quadrant 1, which is kind of bottom left, you were working on some small innovative startup-like experiment that was typically driven by a GM. And there could be many of these going on at any one given time. And you have your measures and level of investment and KPIs and everything else if you were quadrant 1. And you kind of knew what that looked like. The goal of a quadrant 1 was to ultimately move up into quadrant 2. Quadrant 2 was one of those innovative things that the CEO then took over and drove as a company-wide initiative. And the CEO could only drive one of these like massive change kind of initiatives. And so the goal of a quadrant 1 was to move into quadrant 2 to then be for the year the thing that the CEO really kind of drove it and invested in. If you were in quadrant 3, you were a mature part of the business that gave the business the air to exist, right? So you were a mature business, and again, with every single one, different levels of investment, different ways of prioritizing and thinking. And if you were in quadrant 4, you were in service of all the others. That's where like marketing and sales and finance and all those things went. And so we found that by thinking about those quadrants, you could have a very good conversation with somebody and you knew where your business unit was and how you would behave depending on which quadrant you were in. And that was pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think that's in escape velocity, if I'm not mistaken. Zone to win.
You may have developed that in our offices. It came out before the book.
I know that Rick worked on that too. One other thing that I find is, and Tom, I think you nailed it, is you've got to be willing to move before you have it all figured out, right? You're not going to have all the data. You're not going to be able to run all the analyses. You just have to move. And by moving forward, you create new and different options. And by moving into the market, you're creating new and different options. And this is true for the big and the small. That forward momentum begins to create its own momentum. And the trap, I think, for more established companies saying we need to act like a startup. I say, yeah, we do, but you know what? Like, I don't know that that's going to be overall accretive to our total gross margin. And if I look at, stop. Okay, if you're having that conversation, you're not in quadrant 1. You're not trying to act like a startup. You're not a Horizon 3, I think is the model would call it. You're trying to apply the metrics and methods and measures that are appropriate to an established business that applies the air to the rest of the operation to something different. So don't be confused about how to run each piece of the business would be counsel there. So I think it's probably a good time to light up the mics and see if anybody has questions they'd like to pose.
Hi, my name is Gideon. I wanted to ask you, how do you see idea management in all this? Is it 10 guys in a room with pizzas and whatever they come up, or there is some kind of a, company-wide idea management evolution, and how you manage that?
Man. I'll jump in, and Alex, please save me when I start flailing. So
Why do you think I looked at you first?
exactly. So look, I am. I'm not a fan of the notion that, hey, we, as a company, we need to broadly have better ideas. I'm a big fan of saying a challenge that we need to accomplish is X, and I would love to encourage ideas about that, or we've decided we're going to put a special project team on it. So, for example, one of our portfolio companies that, when they were not that big, it's a storage company, Pure Storage, went after, anybody knows storage and data center stuff like block storage, but they had to have a very different approach to go after file storage, right? And basically, they took one of their founders, right? So one of their technical minds behind the company, and said, build whatever team you want to go after that market, right? And so, like, I'm a bigger fan of saying what's the challenge versus what's the idea, and how do you think about idea management, and that may be built into what you're saying, but I'm a bigger believer that someone in the company needs to think about the challenge and the strategy, and from that, great ideas and or great teams can go after it. So I don't know. It may not answer your question, but that's kind of the way I think about it. So,
Alex?
Yeah, I'd say that you want everybody in the company thinking, not probably 10 guys in a pizza room.
I'm thinking about a chip, like for your example, that they have 2 ideas per employee implemented every day. Maybe something as small as changing the format from landscape to portrait in a certain application that doesn't require you to make 2 movements or just
Yeah.
That's an idea that they implemented.
Yeah.
Sounds simple, but when you consistently implement 2 ideas in every employee, and here startups, established companies implement 2 ideas totally. Ideas that came from a line of people. I mean, I've talked with people, no matter what business, you talk about interviewing everybody, nobody called them in 10 years, asked, what do you think? And then the guys who feel.
Yeah, so what we do is, we actually don't tell teams and groups what to do. We put a goal or a challenge in front of them, and they figure it out. So they're constantly coming up with different and interesting ideas to be able to solve for those kind of goals and challenges. And then we do fun stuff like hack days, where everybody can just mess around and do things outside of kind of their day-to-day purview, and that seems to work pretty well.
that's cool.
Question on this side?
Yes, Alex, I'm going to ask you to beat this horse a little bit longer about V2 Mom. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you think about parsing the goals out, how you organize the teams, et cetera?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Siri. So, yeah. All right, we can start with Siri. Shake it up fine.
Next question.
You didn't know I was a ventriloquist.
That was good. That was impressive.
That was
well
impressive.
done, sir.
So the way that it works is you come up with a vision for the year and cut 3 values that underpin that vision. And then this is the next really important part. Methods, which would be kind of departmental methods to support that, are then prioritized. The prioritization is incredibly important. And then every method itself has obstacles and measures. So when you talk about goals, the methods themselves have the measures inside of them. Again, 3 core measures for each method. So let's say you had a marketing method, and whatever that method might be called, the goal might be help acquire 10,000 customers a month. It would be a high-level measure that then they need to figure out how to get to and support of, because they would then have their own kind of cascade from there. So again, methods, 3 goals per method, and then at the company level, there's 4 effectively core KPIs or goals that all of those things come up to. In our case, it's revenue, bookings, new customers, and revenue retention. And then each group creates their own V2MOM framework for how are they going to get to those high-level goals that you set for them.
I just wanted to amplify on something Xavier said. In my first venture financed company, one of the things that was interesting was I sat with my development manager and he said, now you need to realize the first version of the product is going to be a pig with lipstick. That actually then became our mascot. So just, you have to get out there, you have to get customers beating it up and telling you what you do.
No, I think your point's totally valid. I mean, you hear all this, be embarrassed by your first product and all these kinds of things. And we are big fans of conversations between potential customers. If it's on the consumer side, it makes much more sense to get that first version out. If you're more an enterprise customer, I mean, one of the things we do and a lot of firms do is we will bring technology leaders from large enterprises together with our young companies and tell them to rip them to shreds, right? Because it's that exact same notion of, how do you continue to iterate and drive it? And I think that stuff's crucial, especially for companies that are founded in Silicon Valley, because we drink our own Kool-Aid a little bit too much. So
Yeah, internally we call that continuous improvement versus delayed perfection.
it's a good call.
So just to continue with that thought, I like the pigs with lipstick. So my experience with managers is there's mostly a CYA management style when failure happens. And there's a lot of lip service that we as executives pay to fail early and fast and so forth. But when you get into the organization, it gets lost in translation. So what is your experience of changing the culture in terms of those management practices that we manage those failures productively? And we're not just saying, we're actually doing it.
I'm a huge fan that executives like yourself have to be the first person to admit failure. So, I say to people all the time, so for example, I have the, bad fact in my past that, I started a company that Greylock backed, lost Greylock money, right? It was not a good experience. And I tell people that all the time, mostly because first off, like a lot of people will come to a venture firm, especially if they're young, and it's sort of a daunting notion of like, oh my God, if I don't get money here, I'm going to be done. And we don't want that. What we want is someone to show us why their company could become the next massive company. So it's the same kind of thing to me. Like, if you find like your managers are not able to accept that, I think part of it is on you, right? You need to show you need to be vulnerable. You need to show them like, look, I've screwed these kinds of things up. I had a guy I used to work with, he said every single management team meeting he started off with, what did I screw up this week? What did I learn from it? And how am I going to improve from that? So I'm a huge believer that you got to show that vulnerability at the top, and then that starts becoming part of the culture. So
I want to build on that a little bit, Tom. I think one of the things I say often is bad news early. Bad news early. And if you demonstrate that, and you demand that of your team, it changes the dynamic. Because frankly, bad news early oftentimes can become good news later. But if everybody's at the mindset like, oh shit, this could go wrong, I don't want Xavier to know, I don't want Tom to know, I don't want, like, no. We can't help you if we don't know. And if you are truly establishing an operation where you are in service to your team, you will get bad news early and you will be able to help. And that's where you get into this, I think, a virtuous cycle of, it is okay to fail. We are going to take risks. We need to have the bad news early because if we don't know what's happening, we can't actually help course correct.
Yeah, I think it was Edison who said he failed his way to success. I think it's those two things, and I would add one more. I mean, it's lead by example. I think that's incredibly important. I couldn't agree more. It's bad news early. And then the third one is make only new mistakes, which is kind of a Facebook mantra. Yeah. But it's those three things, right? And I will celebrate failure all day. And I think it's great, especially if we learn from it. But if you're making the same mistake and you're not sharing it early, then we've got a problem.
So I guess we have time for one more.
short question. I don't take it. One of you talked about value. What's your conception of a digital value? When you said you create value for your customers, your employees, and maybe it's other public. I'm still trying to figure out what is the digital value in this, because there is something called is the general value, which is the digital technology is just a means to achieve the value, or is it something called, is there inherently something digital value? I'm sort of, or is it too much of a philosophical question at 5 o'clock in the afternoon? So.
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, digital is a fact of life. I don't think it's a value. I do think it's a means to an end. You know, our values are things like, our number one value is make mum proud, which is a very Australian way to kind of say it, but it governs how we behave and how we treat one another. Another one of our values is if our customers kick ass, we will too. So it's thinking about how we ensure that the customer kind of has a voice in our dialogue. Another value is care about why. Don't do something, question it, and care about why. Another one of our values is be the change you want to see. I don't want a whole bunch of people sitting around upset about what's happening. If they see something that's not going the right way, then actually be the change agent. And then the last value is do less but do it best. And this is the idea that we can't do everything, and when we try, we fail. So we have to hyper-focus on what we want to do and do a really great job at it. Those are our values. There's no digital value or AI value or anything else.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the less you think of digital as this thing on the side, and it's just business, and it's just how we do what we do. I've been told to stop.
We've got to stop.
The better you are.
Thank you, Zave.
Yeah.
It was fun.
What's up, man? It was a lot of fun.